At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. The moment had been anticipated for hours. Word had spread through the trenches that an armistice had been signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Campigny, that the killing would stop at precisely 11:00 a.m. Yet even knowing this, commanders on both sides had continued to order attacks through the morning. Artillery barrages had thundered across no man's land. Machine guns had shattered. Men had died, thousands of them, in the final hours of a war that was already over. At 10:59 a.m., a Canadian private named George Lawrence Price was shot through the chest by a German sniper while advancing on a house in the Belgian town of Vilser-Hessenay. He died at 10:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the ceasefire, becoming one of the last soldiers killed in the Great War. He was 25 years old, and he had survived 4 years of the bloodiest conflict in human history only to die in its final moments. Then, at 11:00 a.m., an eerie quiet descended upon the battlefield. The constant thunder of artillery that had defined life on the Western Front for 4 years simply stopped. The crack of rifle fire ceased. The whine of shells overhead ended. Men who had lived with the sound of death as their constant companion suddenly found themselves in silence so profound that many believed they had gone dead. Along 600 miles of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, soldiers emerged from their positions and stared at each other across the devastated landscape. Some wept. Some cheered. Some stood in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend that they had survived. German and Allied soldiers who had been trying to kill each other minutes before now regarded one another with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about what came next. In Paris, crowds flooded into the streets, singing the Marseillaise, embracing strangers, celebrating the victory that had seemed so distant just months before. In London, church bells rang for the first time since the war began. They had been silenced in 1914 to be reserved for warning of invasion. In New York, ticker tape rained down on Fifth Avenue as Americans celebrated the triumph of what President Woodrow Wilson had called the war to end all wars. But in Berlin, the mood was different. Crowds gathered, but they did not celebrate. Germany had not been invaded. German soldiers still stood on foreign soil, yet somehow, inexplicably to many Germans, the war was lost. The Kaiser had fled to the Netherlands 2 days earlier. A republic had been proclaimed. Revolutionaries were battling in the streets. And the army that had seemed invincible was marching home in defeat without ever having been decisively beaten on the battlefield, or so millions of Germans believed. The Armistice of November 11, 1918, ended the fighting of the First World War. But it did not end the war itself. The hatreds, the grievances, the revolutionary fervor, the collapse of empires and the birth of new nations, the hunger and disease and chaos, all of these continued. In many parts of Europe, the violence actually intensified after the armistice as civil wars, revolutions, and ethnic conflicts erupted in the vacuum left by the fallen empires. The war that began in 1914 and supposedly ended in 1918 would resume in 1939, more terrible than before. The Second World War was not a separate conflict, but a continuation, a second act in a tragedy that had only paused, not concluded. This is the story of how the end of one world war planted the seeds of another, of how victory was squandered and defeat was transformed into grievance, of how idealism clashed with vengeance and vengeance won, of how the collapse of empires created chaos that would take decades to resolve, of how a generation that had suffered through the war to end all wars would watch helplessly as their children marched off to fight an even greater one. This is the story of the war that never ended. To understand how the Armistice of 1918 led to the catastrophe of 1939, we must first understand what the First World War had done to Europe. The statistics alone are staggering. Approximately 10 million soldiers died in the 4 years of fighting. 20 million more were wounded, many permanently maimed, blinded by gas, missing limbs, psychologically shattered by what they had witnessed. Civilian deaths from famine, disease, and violence added millions more to the toll. An entire generation of young men had been fed into the machinery of industrial warfare and ground to pieces. The physical destruction was immense. Northern France and Belgium had been transformed into a wasteland of craters, shattered trees, and ruined villages. Entire towns had been erased from the map. The industrial regions of France that Germany occupied had been systematically stripped of machinery and resources. Russia's western provinces had been devastated by years of fighting and occupation. But the human and material losses, vast as they were only part of the story. The war had destroyed something less tangible but equally important: the old European order. Four great empires that had dominated the continent for centuries had collapsed in the span of 4 years. The Russian Empire, the largest state on Earth, had disintegrated first. The strains of war had proven too much for the creaking autocracy of Tsar Nicholas II. In February 1917, riots in Petrograd led to the Tsar's abdication and the establishment of a provisional government. That government, fatally weakened by its decision to continue the war, had been overthrown in October 1917 by Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks, who promised peace, land, and bread to the exhausted Russian people. The Bolshevik Revolution transformed not just Russia, but the entire political landscape of Europe. For the first time, a major power was governed by a regime explicitly dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism and the spread of worldwide revolution. The specter of Bolshevism, of workers' councils seizing power, of property being confiscated, of the established order being swept away, would haunt European politics for the next 3 decades. Fear of Bolshevism would drive millions into the arms of fascism. The ideological conflict between communism and its opponents would shape the interwar period and, ultimately, the Second World War itself. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the sprawling multinational realm of the Habsburgs that had dominated Central Europe for centuries, simply fell apart in the final weeks of the war. The various nationalities that had been held together by dynastic loyalty declared their independence one after another. Czechoslovakia proclaimed itself a republic on October 28, 1918. The South Slavs formed the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, on December 1. Hungary declared independence. Austria was reduced to a small landlocked republic that many doubted could survive on its own. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled much of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe for 5 centuries, collapsed under the combined weight of military defeat, Arab revolt, and internal disintegration. The Armistice at Mudros on October 30, 1918, ended Ottoman participation in the war, but the empire's territories were already being carved up by Britain and France according to secret wartime agreements. The modern Middle East, with all its conflicts and contradictions, was being created in the wreckage of Ottoman power. And Germany, the most powerful of the Central Powers, experienced its own revolution in the war's final days. The German military leadership, recognizing that the war was lost, had demanded that civilian politicians seek an armistice so that the army could avoid the humiliation of surrender. Kaiser Wilhelm II, facing mutiny in the navy and revolution in the streets, abdicated on November 9 and fled to the Netherlands. The Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert became the leader of a provisional government that immediately had to contend with revolutionary challenges from both left and right. The Germany that signed the armistice on November 11 was not the Germany that had begun the war in August 1914. The Kaiser was gone. The old order had collapsed, a republic had been proclaimed, but its authority was uncertain and its future unclear. Revolutionary councils modeled on the Russian Soviets were forming in cities across Germany. Armed groups of various political affiliations roamed the streets. The question was not whether Germany had lost the war, that was settled, but what kind of Germany would emerge from the wreckage. The armistice itself was not a peace treaty, but merely an agreement to stop fighting while peace terms were negotiated. The terms were harsh. Germany had to withdraw its forces behind the Rhine within 15 days. It had to surrender massive quantities of war material, 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 1,700 aircraft, 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 railway cars, and 5,000 trucks. The naval blockade of Germany, which had caused widespread hunger and contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German civilians, would continue until a peace treaty was signed. The Allied commanders who dictated these terms intended them to prevent Germany from resuming hostilities. They succeeded in that aim. But the terms also created a sense of grievance that would poison German politics for years. Germany had agreed to an armistice, not a surrender. German territory had not been invaded. The German army was marching home in good order, its flags flying. Yet Germany was being treated as a defeated enemy, stripped of the means to resist, subjected to a continuing blockade that was starving its people. This gap between perception and reality, between the German army's apparent strength and Germany's actual helplessness, created fertile ground for a myth that would have catastrophic consequences. The stab in the back legend. The stab in the back myth Dolchstoß Legend emerged almost immediately after the armistice and became one of the most destructive lies in modern history. The myth held that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield but had been betrayed by enemies at home, by Jews, by socialists, by Republicans, by defeatists who had undermined the war effort while brave soldiers fought and died at the front. The army had been stabbed in the back by the very people who now governed Germany. The defeat was not a military failure but a political betrayal. The myth was a lie, but it was a seductive lie that served powerful interests. It allowed the German military leadership to escape responsibility for a war they had led Germany into and then lost. It allowed German nationalists to believe that Germany remained a great power that had been cheated of victory, rather than a defeated nation that had to accept the consequences of its actions. And it provided a ready-made scapegoat for all of Germany's post-war troubles: the Jews, the socialists, the November criminals who had signed the armistice and would sign the hated peace treaty. The origins of the myth can be traced to the final months of the war. In August 1918, the Allies had launched a massive offensive that shattered German defensive lines and made clear that victory was impossible. General Erich Ludendorff, the de facto military dictator of Germany, suffered what appears to have been a nervous breakdown. He demanded that the civilian government seek an armistice immediately before the army collapsed entirely. But having demanded that civilians negotiate the armistice, Ludendorff and the military leadership then distanced themselves from the result. They allowed the new civilian government, composed largely of social democrats who had opposed the war, to take responsibility for ending the conflict. When the terms of the armistice were announced, the military could claim that it had been betrayed by politicians, that the army had never been beaten, that defeat was the fault of the home front rather than the high command. The myth was given its most famous expression by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who would later become president of Germany and appoint Adolf Hitler as chancellor. In testimony before a parliamentary committee in 1919, Hindenburg declared, "As an English general has very truly said, the German army was stabbed in the back." The quote was fabricated. No English general had said any such thing, but it became gospel for German nationalists. The stab in the back myth was particularly devastating because it prevented Germany from coming to terms with its defeat. Other nations that had lost the war, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, understood that they had been beaten. They might resent the peace terms, might seek to revise them, but they did not deny the reality of their defeat. Germany, in contrast, nursed a collective delusion that victory had been stolen from it, that the war had not really been lost, that with the right leadership and sufficient will, Germany could reclaim its rightful place among the great powers. This delusion made it impossible to build a stable democracy in Germany. The Weimar Republic, proclaimed in the Revolution of November 1918, was forever tainted by its association with the armistice and the peace treaty that followed. The Republicans who governed Germany were the November criminals who had betrayed the nation. Every crisis, every hardship, every humiliation could be traced back to the original betrayal. And the solution to Germany's problems was not democratic reform or international cooperation, but the destruction of the Republican order and the reversal of the verdict of 1918. Adolf Hitler understood this better than anyone. He had been a corporal in the German army, temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in the final weeks of the war. He was in a military hospital when news of the armistice came. Years later, he would describe his reaction. "I knew that all was lost. In those nights, hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed." The stab-in-the-back myth gave Hitler his political mission: to destroy the traitors who had betrayed Germany and to reverse the outcome of the war. The Nazi movement was built on the foundation of the Deutschland. As the diplomats prepared to gather in Paris to make peace, Europe was consumed by violence and chaos that made a mockery of the armistice. In Germany, the new republic faced immediate challenges from both left and right. The Spartacist uprising in Berlin in January 1919 attempted to establish a Soviet-style government in Germany. The Spartacists, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, seized buildings and declared the overthrow of the provisional government. Friedrich Ebert's government, lacking reliable military forces of its own, turned to an unlikely ally: the Freikorps. The Freikorps were volunteer military units composed largely of demobilized soldiers who could not or would not return to civilian life. They were armed, organized, and deeply hostile to the revolution. Many were motivated by nationalism and anti-Bolshevism. Some were simply men who had been brutalized by 4 years of war and knew no other way of life. They would become the shock troops of the counter-revolution. In Berlin, Freikorps units crushed the Spartacist uprising with extreme violence. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were captured, beaten, and murdered. Luxemburg's body was dumped in a canal, where it was not discovered for months. The pattern was set. The Republic would survive by relying on forces that were fundamentally hostile to democracy, forces that would later turn against the Republic itself. The violence was not limited to Berlin. In Bavaria, a Soviet republic was proclaimed in April 1919, lasting less than a month before being crushed by Freikorps and regular army units with tremendous bloodshed. In the Baltic states, German Freikorps fought against Bolsheviks and local nationalists in a confused struggle that continued long after the armistice. In Hungary, Béla Kun established a communist government that was overthrown after 133 days, leading to a White Terror, in which thousands of suspected communists and Jews were killed. One Freikorps soldier who participated in the fighting in Bavaria would later become the second highest official in Nazi Germany. His name was Rudolf Hess. Another, Ernst Röhm, would organize the Nazi stormtroopers. The Freikorps were the training ground for the generation of right-wing militants who would destroy the Weimar Republic and lead Germany into the Second World War. Beyond Germany, the collapse of empires created power vacuums that were filled with violence. In the former Russian Empire, a civil war raged between the Bolshevik Reds and a hodgepodge of anti-Bolshevik forces collectively called the Whites. The fighting would continue until 1922 and claim an estimated 7 to 12 million lives, more than had died in the entire First World War. Foreign powers intervened. British, French, American, and Japanese forces occupied parts of Russia in a half-hearted attempt to support the Whites and prevent Bolshevism from spreading. In the former Ottoman territories, new conflicts erupted. The Greek-Turkish War of 1919-1922 would result in massive population exchanges and atrocities on both sides. The Arab territories that Britain and France had promised to liberate found themselves under European mandate, their hopes for independence deferred. The modern Middle East was being created through a combination of diplomatic agreements, military force, and the suppression of local aspirations. In Central Europe, the successor states to Austro-Hungary fought over territory. Poland and Czechoslovakia clashed over Teschen. Romania seized Transylvania from Hungary. Yugoslavia incorporated territories claimed by Italy. Borders were drawn and redrawn, often with little regard for ethnic realities or economic logic. Millions of people found themselves as minorities in new states, their loyalties questioned and their rights uncertain. The historian Robert Jerworth has called this period the greatest wave of political and ethnic violence in European history between the 30 Years' War and World War II. The armistice had ended the fighting between the major powers, but it had unleashed 100 smaller conflicts that would smolder for years. Into this chaos came a pandemic that would kill more people than the war itself. The Spanish flu, which had emerged in the spring of 1918, spread with terrifying speed as soldiers demobilized and returned to their homes. Crowded troop ships, packed train stations, and victory celebrations provided ideal conditions for transmission. The virus, unlike typical influenza strains, was especially deadly to young adults, the same demographic that had been most heavily represented in the armies. Men who had survived 4 years of trench warfare died within days of reaching home. The pandemic killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, possibly more. In some communities, mortality was so high that bodies could not be buried fast enough. The virus struck with particular fury in areas already weakened by war and famine. In Germany, where the naval blockade had created widespread malnutrition, the flu found easy victims. In India, which had sent over 1 million soldiers to fight for the British Empire, the pandemic killed an estimated 18 million people, more than the total military deaths of all nations in the entire First World War. The flu pandemic added to the sense of apocalypse that pervaded the immediate post-war period. The war had been bad enough, but now an invisible enemy was killing even more people. Medical science, which had made such strides in treating battlefield wounds, was helpless against the virus. There was no treatment, no cure, no way to stop the spread. People wore masks, avoided crowds, prayed, and died anyway. For the generation that lived through 1918, 1919, the combination of war, revolution, and pandemic created a sense that the old world had ended. The certainties of the pre-war era, progress, civilization, the stability of empires, the power of science to solve problems had been shattered. Something new was coming, but no one knew what it would be. The mood was captured by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats in The Second Coming, written in January 1919. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst they are full of passionate intensity. Yeats sensed that something terrible was approaching, a rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem to be born. He could not know its name, but he felt its presence. The post-war world was pregnant with catastrophe. It was in this atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty that the peacemakers gathered in Paris in January 1919 to remake the world. The Paris Peace Conference was the largest and most ambitious diplomatic gathering in history. Delegates from 32 nations assembled to redraw the map of Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Borders would be moved, people would be transferred, empires would be dismantled, and new states would be created. The decisions made in Paris would shape the 20th century, for better and more often for worse. The conference was dominated by 3 men: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Britain. These big 3, sometimes expanded to a big 4 including Vittorio Orlando of Italy, made the key decisions, often in private meetings from which lesser powers were excluded. The defeated nations, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, were not allowed to participate in the negotiations. They would be presented with terms and given the choice to sign or face continued blockade and possible military action. Each of the big 3 brought different goals and perspectives to the conference. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe as the first American president to visit the continent while in office. He was greeted with almost messianic enthusiasm by crowds who saw him as the prophet of a new international order based on justice rather than power politics. Wilson had articulated his vision for peace in his famous 14 points, which called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of trade barriers, reduction of armaments, and, most importantly, the right of peoples to self-determination. Wilson believed that the old system of secret alliances and imperial competition had caused the war. Replace it with a new system of collective security through a League of Nations, allow people to govern themselves according to democratic principles, and war would become a thing of the past. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps naively so, but it inspired millions of people who longed for a world without war. Georges Clemenceau, the 77-year-old Prime Minister of France, had a very different perspective. He had lived through France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. He had seen northern France devastated twice in his lifetime. He had no illusions about German intentions or the possibility of lasting friendship between France and Germany. Clemenceau wanted security for France, and that meant weakening Germany permanently. He wanted the return of Alsace-Lorraine, of course. He wanted massive reparations to pay for the reconstruction of France. He wanted the Rhineland separated from Germany and placed under French protection. He wanted Germany disarmed so thoroughly that it could never again threaten France. Wilson talks like Jesus Christ but acts like Lloyd George, Clemenceau reportedly said. He had no patience for idealism that did not serve French interests. David Lloyd George occupied a middle position. Britain had achieved its main war aims. The German fleet had surrendered, German colonies had been seized, and German commercial competition had been eliminated. Lloyd George wanted a peace that would prevent future German aggression, but that would also prevent France from becoming too dominant on the continent. A weak Germany might be unable to resist Bolshevism or to serve as a market for British goods. The balance of power had to be maintained. Lloyd George was also a politician who had just won an election campaign dominated by demands to hang the Kaiser and squeeze Germany until the pips squeak. British public opinion demanded harsh terms, and Lloyd George had to deliver, even if he privately doubted the wisdom of excessive vindictiveness. The negotiations lasted for 6 months from January to June 1919. The details were enormously complex, drawing borders, assigning blame, calculating reparations, creating new institutions, managing colonial territories. Hundreds of experts and advisors worked on the various commissions. Mountains of documents were produced, compromises were made, bargains were struck, principles were sacrificed to expediency. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had triggered the war. It was one of the most controversial documents in history, praised by some as a reasonable settlement under impossible circumstances, condemned by others as a vindictive catastrophe that made another war inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany the harshest terms any major power had experienced since the fall of Napoleon. Territorially, Germany lost about 13% of its pre-war territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, reversing the German gains of 1871. The provinces of Posen and West Prussia were given to Poland, creating the Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The port of Danzig became a free city under League of Nations protection. The coal-rich Saar region was placed under League administration for 15 years, with a plebiscite to determine its future. Small territories went to Belgium and Denmark. All of Germany's overseas colonies were seized and distributed among the victors as mandates. Militarily, Germany was disarmed to the point of helplessness. The army was limited to 100,000 men, too few to threaten any major power. The Navy was restricted to a handful of small warships. Submarines were banned entirely. The Air Force was abolished. Germany was forbidden to have military aircraft. The Rhineland was demilitarized. No German forces could be stationed there, and occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. The General Staff was dissolved. Military schools were closed. War material was to be surrendered or destroyed. Economically, Germany was burdened with an obligation to pay reparations for the damage caused by the war. The exact amount was not specified in the treaty. That was left to a reparations commission that would later set it at 132 billion gold marks, approximately $33 billion at the time, or roughly $442 billion in today's money. And today's money? Germany was also required to deliver coal ships, livestock, and railway equipment to the victors. German rivers were internationalized. German patents and intellectual property were confiscated. Most controversially, Article 231 of the treaty required Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This war guilt clause was intended primarily as a legal justification for reparations Germany was being made to pay, because Germany was responsible for the damage. But Germans read it as a moral condemnation, a declaration that Germany was uniquely evil and deserved to be punished. The War Guilt Clause became the most hated provision of the treaty, a constant reminder of humiliation that nationalists would never accept. The German delegation was given the treaty on May 7, 1919, and ordered to sign. There was no negotiation. The German government protested, pointing out that the terms violated the principles of the 14 points that had been the basis for the armistice. Some members of the cabinet wanted to reject the treaty and resume fighting, but the military made clear that resistance was impossible. The army was demoralized. The blockade was starving the civilian population, and the Allies were prepared to invade. On June 28, Germany signed. The Treaty of Versailles was designed to prevent Germany from ever again threatening the peace of Europe. In this, it failed utterly. The treaty was harsh enough to generate lasting resentment, but not harsh enough to permanently weaken Germany. It humiliated Germany without destroying Germany's potential to become powerful again. It created grievances that nationalist politicians could exploit while leaving Germany with the resources to eventually seek revenge. One observer at the Paris Peace Conference predicted with uncanny accuracy what would follow. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist who had served as a Treasury representative, resigned in protest over the treaty terms. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, argued that the reparations were impossibly high, that the economic provisions would destroy Germany's economy and by extension Europe's economy, and that the vindictive spirit of the treaty would lead to disaster. The policy of reducing Germany to servitude for a generation, Keynes wrote, of degrading the lives of millions of human beings and of depriving a whole nation of happiness should be abhorrent and detestable. Abhorrent and detestable, even if it were possible, even if it enriched ourselves, even if it did not sow the decay of the whole civilized life of Europe. Keynes was not alone in his concerns. Even some of those who negotiated the treaty had doubts. Lloyd George himself, in a memorandum written during the negotiations, warned, "We shall have to fight another war again in 25 years. He was off by only 4 years. The treaties with the other defeated powers, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, created their own problems. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria and the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary dismembered the Austro-Hungarian Empire according to the principle of national self-determination. But the principle was applied inconsistently. Where self-determination would benefit the victorious powers or the new successor states, it was honored. Where it would benefit the defeated powers, it was ignored. Austria was reduced to a small, landlocked republic of about 7 million people. The Sudetenland, populated largely by Germans, was awarded to Czechoslovakia rather than being allowed to join Germany or Austria. Austria itself was forbidden from uniting with Germany, the Anschluss that the vast majority of Austrian Germans desired. The principle of self-determination evidently did not apply to Germans. Hungary suffered even more severely. The Treaty of Trianon stripped Hungary of 2/3 of its territory and 3/5 of its population. Transylvania went to Romania. Slovakia went to the new Czechoslovakia. Croatia went to the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Over 3 million ethnic Hungarians found themselves living as minorities in neighboring states. Hungarian resentment at the Treaty of Trianon would persist for decades and would make Hungary a willing ally of Nazi Germany. The Treaty of Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire was even more drastic, partitioning Anatolia itself among Greece, Italy, France, and an independent Armenia while placing the straits under international control. But the treaty was never fully implemented. Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal, later Atatürk, rejected the terms and fought a war of independence that succeeded in reversing most of the territorial losses. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 recognized a Turkish state roughly equivalent to modern Turkey. The Middle Eastern provisions of the peace settlement created problems that persist to this day. Britain and France divided the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire between them as mandates under League of Nations supervision. Britain took Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain had promised support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, was incorporated into the British Mandate, creating a conflict that has never been resolved. The borders drawn in Paris were arbitrary, often ignoring ethnic, religious, and tribal realities. Iraq was cobbled together from 3 Ottoman provinces with very different populations: Kurds in the north, Sunni Arabs in the center, Shia Arabs in the south. Syria was divided from Lebanon along sectarian lines. The seeds of a century of conflict were planted in the conference rooms of Paris. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope for preventing future wars, was established as part of the peace settlement. Its covenant was incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles and the other peace treaties. Headquarters were established in Geneva. Machinery for the peaceful resolution of disputes was created. Collective security was promised. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. But the League was fatally weakened from the start. The United States, whose participation Wilson had assumed, refused to join. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles in November 1919, primarily because of opposition to the League covenant. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions. Britain and France, the League's most powerful members, were unwilling to commit military forces to uphold collective security unless their own interests were directly threatened. Germany and the Soviet Union were initially excluded from the League, meaning that 2 of Europe's most powerful nations were outside the system. When they eventually joined, Germany in 1926, the Soviet Union in 1934, their participation was reluctant and temporary. Japan and Italy, founding members, would withdraw when the League opposed their aggression. The League would have some successes in resolving minor disputes and would do valuable work in humanitarian areas. But when confronted with determined aggression by major powers, it would prove helpless. The Manchurian Crisis of 1931, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, and the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 each demonstrated that the League could condemn aggression but could not prevent it. By the time Hitler began his march toward war, the League was a hollow shell, incapable of fulfilling the hopes that had been invested in it. The generation that made the peace of 1919 did not intend to create the conditions for another war. They believed, for the most part, that they were building a lasting settlement. They had experienced the horror of the Great War firsthand. Clemenceau had been wounded in the Franco-Prussian War. Lloyd George had lost relatives. Wilson had sent American boys to die in France. And they genuinely wanted to prevent such a catastrophe from occurring. But they were constrained by circumstances they could not fully control. Public opinion in the victorious countries demanded harsh terms. The chaos and violence of the immediate post-war period made calm deliberation difficult. The sheer complexity of the issues, drawing borders in regions where populations were hopelessly intermingled, calculating reparations for damage that could not truly be quantified. Creating new institutions for international governance exceeded the capacity of any group of statesmen to solve perfectly, and they faced fundamental contradictions that could not be resolved. Wilson's principle of self-determination was incompatible with the territorial demands of the Allied powers. Security for France was incompatible with a Germany strong enough to resist Bolshevism. Reparations sufficient to rebuild France were incompatible with German economic recovery. The treaty tried to satisfy everyone and satisfied no one. One German soldier who had lived through the war and its aftermath understood the implications better than most. He had served in the trenches, had been gassed, had experienced the shock of the armistice and the humiliation of the treaty. He was convinced that Germany had been betrayed, that the Weimar Republic was the tool of Germany's enemies, that the Treaty of Versailles must be overthrown. He spent the early 1920s in Munich, joining a small extremist party and developing the ideology that would eventually lead Germany back to war. His name was Adolf Hitler, and the Treaty of Versailles was his greatest recruiting tool. As the year 1919 drew to a close, the outlines of the post-war world were becoming clear. Europe was divided into victors and vanquished, with the vanquished nursing grievances that would not fade. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria all felt themselves unjustly treated, stripped of territory, burdened with reparations, and blamed for a war they did not believe they had caused alone. They would seek to revise the peace settlement at the first opportunity. The new states of Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Baltic nations, were fragile creations, often containing significant minorities whose loyalty was uncertain. They were surrounded by revisionist powers. Germany to the west, Soviet Russia to the east, Hungary to the south, that coveted their territory. Their survival depended on the willingness of Britain and France to defend them, a willingness that was already waning. The Soviet Union, though weakened by civil war and foreign intervention, was consolidating its power and proclaiming its intention to spread revolution worldwide. The specter of Bolshevism haunted European politics, driving many into the arms of authoritarian movements that promised to defend order against chaos. The colonial empires were beginning to crack. Nationalist movements in India, Egypt, and elsewhere had taken inspiration from Wilson's rhetoric about self-determination, even as the peace settlement denied them independence. The great European empires would survive for another generation, but the foundations were weakening. And everywhere the scars of war remained, the cemeteries with their rows of white crosses, the mutilated veterans begging on street corners, the widows and orphans, the ruined landscapes, the memories of horror that could not be erased. An entire generation had been marked by the war, and they would carry those marks for the rest of their lives. One British soldier, looking back on the war years later, wrote, "We thought we had fought the war to end wars. We thought we had made the world safe for democracy. So we thought the sacrifice had been worth it. We were wrong. The peace we made was no peace at all. It was only a truce, and we were too exhausted to see it." The Armistice of November 11th, 1918 had ended the fighting. But the war that ended in 1918 was never truly settled. The grievances it created, the hatreds it unleashed, the chaos it left behind, all of these would fester for 2 decades. The Second World War would not be a new conflict, but a resumption of the old one, fought by the children of the men who had died in the trenches over the same issues that had never been resolved. The war that was supposed to end all wars had planted the seeds of an even greater catastrophe. The road from the Armistice of 1918 to the invasion of Poland in 1939 was direct, even if no one standing at its beginning could see its end. The decisions made in the railway carriage at Compiègne, in the conference rooms of Paris, in the streets of Berlin and Munich, these decisions shaped everything that followed. This is why we begin our story not in September 1939, when the Second World War officially began, but in November 1918, when the First World War supposedly ended. To understand the Second World War, we must understand the peace that failed. To understand Hitler's rise, we must understand the Treaty of Versailles. To understand the catastrophe that consumed 70 million lives, we must understand the war that never truly ended. The guns fell silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, but the silence was deceptive. In that silence, the forces that would produce an even greater war were already gathering strength. The Second World War began not with the invasion of Poland, but with the failure of peace. It began in the railway carriage at Compiègne, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, in the streets of Berlin where Freikorps soldiers murdered revolutionaries, in the hospitals where young men died of influenza after surviving 4 years of combat. The war that never ended would continue. And when it resumed, it would be more terrible than anyone in November 1918 could have imagined. Next time, we will follow the peacemakers to Paris and witness the creation of the Treaty of Versailles in detail. We will see how the high hopes of January 1919 were ground down by the realities of power politics, how Wilson's idealism collided with Clemenceau's determination to secure France, and how borders were drawn that would become the battle lines of the next war. We will examine the treaty's provisions and its flaws, and we will see how its terms created the grievances that Adolf Hitler exploited. Was supposed to remake the world, instead made a world at war.